This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
Here we go again. Just 4 years after the start of the Russia-Ukraine war and the huge energy crisis that sparked, and we have another one, this time from a conflict involving the US and Israel hitting Iran and blocking energy exports from the Strait of Hormuz.
So we're recording this on March 12th, where the war has entered its second week. And it's basically all anyone can be talking about or can be concerned with nowadays. The war and its implications on energy prices around the world.
Yes, $100 a barrel, $120 a barrel. Some people are saying $150 a barrel.
And this despite the fact that the International Energy Agency just released its emergency
400
stockpile,
million
right?
barrels, isn't it? Or ordered the release.
Yeah. And apparently this was double the previous time that they released emergency oil supplies after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. And I think Rystad had actually anticipated that under a pre-war scenario, we had expected Brent crude oil to average about $60 per barrel this year. Welcome to Green Pulse, an environmental podcast series at the Straits Times, where we aim to provide you with a Southeast Asian perspective to global environmental challenges. I am one of your co-hosts, Audrey.
And I'm your other co-host, David. So, yes, for Singapore, definitely. 95% of electricity comes from imported gas, mainly from Malaysia and Indonesia. But Singapore has been importing increasing amounts of liquefied natural gas.
So I think the data shows that we have about a 50-50 split between piped natural gas from our neighbours, Malaysia and Indonesia. And the other 50% comes from all over the world in liquefied form, LNG, liquefied natural gas. And of course, that also includes supplies from the Middle East. Gas is traded as a global commodity. The prices of natural gas are pegged to the price of Brent crude oil.
Yeah, globally traded, especially on the spot market. This is what catches out countries that import a lot of gas, including in Southeast Asia, that their spot cargoes suddenly jump in terms of the cost. And in the extreme case, in the months after, or probably the weeks and months after the start of the war against Ukraine, some countries like Bangladesh and Pakistan had to reject LNG cargoes because the price had become just prohibitive for them.
Yeah, and what we are seeing now in many countries in ASEAN, like Thailand, public officers are told to work from home in order to not waste so much fuel traveling on transport. In other countries, there are limits imposed on how much fuel you can fuel up at the gas stations. So I think the implications of what the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is definitely hitting home. For Singapore, I don't think we have to worry as much about, suddenly when we turn on the lights and suddenly there's no electricity because there's no gas coming in because of our diversified energy portfolio, right? We import gas from so many different places around the world. But of course, in terms of prices, that's a separate discussion altogether, right? About electricity prices and so on. So what does this mean for all these discussions about renewable energy? Like, is it even still relevant when people are so focused on all these fossil fuel disruptions now?
I think it makes it even more relevant because what this latest energy crisis shows us fundamentally is that domestic energy security becomes paramount. For poorer nations in ASEAN, for example, particularly those who import a lot of gas and oil, it's more difficult because it's harder to insulate the population from rising energy prices, petrol prices, power prices. And they don't have, a lot of them do not have the financial reserves to do that. And the other complication is there's a lot of existing fuel subsidies that governments have for fuel and for electricity tariffs as it is. So they're already paying out billions of dollars in making energy affordable for their people. It's going to cost them even more to try to keep those subsidies going and, if needed, to increase them. And that then drains the budget for education, potentially for education, for health and other things. And that's just not sustainable for the long term.
Yeah, agree. And I mean, okay, other than fossil fuels, right now it is a dominant contributor to Singapore's energy mix, to ASEAN's energy mix. But both Singapore and the region do have plans to green their energy mixes, right? Like for Singapore, we, as you mentioned, 95% comes from natural gas, but there are plans to increase solar deployment here. There are plans to import green electricity from our neighbours and also explore the use of emerging technologies like geothermal and nuclear even as alternatives. But of course, in this crunch time now, we don't really have access to all these emerging tech, or even the ASEAN Power Grid is still in the works, right? So I think, as you mentioned, it does increase the prominence about renewable energy, thinks that it is a domestic energy resource. It's different from fossil fuels, which, the supply of fossil fuels are concentrated in a few countries. So as this war has highlighted, this concentration of the resource in certain countries also gives them the power. And we see that that's what Iran is doing, right? They are deliberately blocking the Strait of Hormuz, which prevents the oil from being shipped out. They are also actively bombing oil facilities in the Middle East.
Or trying to. Most of their efforts are being shot down. Yeah. So I think what you mentioned about the ASEAN Power Grid is a very important thing. We've talked quite a bit about it. I would hope, although I'm not certain, I would hope that this crisis would focus the minds of business leaders and government leaders in ASEAN to push ahead, to forge ahead, to create the power grid. Because that will, to some extent, at least for electricity, be able to make it easier to shift electricity around the region. So countries like Laos, for example, has lots of hydropower and obviously likes to export any excess. And over time, Vietnam, I think, will have more and more wind power. Malaysia wants to build more hydropower. And obviously, there'll be hopefully a lot more solar in Indonesia and maybe in Malaysia. So all of these things, if you can connect them all, when it comes to the next energy crisis, at least for power prices, the region should be a little bit better insulated. Otherwise, each time these crises come, because energy demands keep rising, this is the other thing. Energy demand is not static, and in ASEAN it's going to keep rising. So for each crisis like this that happens, it's potentially going to cost the region more and be more costly, more disruptive.
Actually, do you think that the world learned any lessons from the last energy crisis in 2022? Because, while that crisis did affect electricity prices here, I think the European countries really felt the brunt of how when Russia invaded Ukraine and, all the sanctions were imposed on Russia, how that suddenly turned off a huge gas supplier in that region, right? Was there any, renewable energy renaissance after that event?
In Europe, yes, definitely. Yeah. So there's been a lot of acceleration of development in wind and solar, power interconnections, particularly, say, to Britain, for example. Britain has really ramped up its offshore wind developments, heat pumps, things like that as well, to cut power demand, solar. There's a lot more to go. Germany, unfortunately, before Ukraine, decided to can its nuclear power plants, so it's had to go back to brown coal. So that's not a good thing.
Yeah, I just heard that was like a strategic mistake, right? For Germany to shut down its nuclear facilities. So, who knew that another war would break out so soon after the Russia-Ukraine war? Yeah,
and now we have two wars with no clear ending. So and we're only 14, not quite 2 weeks into this current conflict with no clear outcome.
Yeah, even the aims of the war are still not clear yet, right? But I guess one of the challenges about realizing this energy security part is that it takes time for all these new energy resources to come online. It takes time for a renewable energy plant to be built.
Quicker than building a big gas plant or coal-fired power station, though.
So the momentum has to continue.
I think it has to accelerate. And I think obviously Singapore sees this, but there's only so much it can do. It's already, I think, its efforts in trying to import up to about 6 gigawatts of low-carbon electricity by 2035, that's helped reignite interest in the ASEAN Power Grid, but it needs to go further. Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam, they all need to run with this. Indonesia has a lot of potential for solar and a little bit of wind, has a lot of potential to expand its geothermal fleet, has an enormous potential to expand its grid and to connect to the rest of ASEAN. These are all positive things that it should be doing, and it is starting to do. It needs to do a lot more of.
Yeah, I think the problem now is for an ASEAN grid to take off, we know for a fact that the resources are there. The renewable energy resources are here in the region.
And very cost effective.
But now the problem is, how can we get humans to actually come together and work together to make all these interconnections happen, to make all these deals happen? And right now, because everyone is so focused on this war and the outcomes, I'm not sure what the conversations are like behind the scenes, whether the conversations are continuing at an increased pace or have they been put on hold? Yeah, so I think for Singapore, we did hear during the budget speech in February that Singapore is trying to increase its solar deployment target. So initially, the plan was to, by 2030, have 2 gigawatt peak. Now we are changing that to...
Yeah, we've already reached the 2.
Yeah, we've reached it last year in 2025.
Yeah.
And now we are trying to hit 3 gigawatt peak instead, which is still not a lot, about 4% of our energy demand. But there have been projections that by 2050, if we deploy solar panels in more places, this figure could reach up to 10%. That's based on a report by the Singapore Energy Research Institute of...
the thing is we're facing...
Solar Research Institute of Singapore.
Right. The thing is we're facing an increasingly uncertain world. We're still heavily reliant on fossil fuels, heavily reliant on imports from what has for long been a very volatile region. It's clear to see that this is not only financially risky, from a national security perspective, it's also very risky. So it's really a responsibility of governments to try to dial down that risk, to find ways to boost domestic energy security.
Yeah.
If nothing else, diversify your resources, where you import your energy, and where possible, invest domestically in your energy, both for electricity, but also obviously for the time, that we still need fossil fuels for transport. And I'll give you a really good example. Admittedly, this is not Singapore and it's not ASEAN, but it's nearby. It's Australia. Australia has an enormous amount of gas, and it's among the top 3 LNG exporters in the world. But because, as you say, gas is priced at an international level, on the east coast of Australia, the most populated part, this sort of crisis instantly pushes up gas prices, even though domestically they should be lower.
Yeah.
The other problem is that I think a lot of people think that Australia has lots of oil. We do, but we don't have enough to meet all our diesel, petrol and aviation fuel needs. So we used to have 8 refineries. We now have 2. Australia imports 90% of its petrol, diesel and aviation fuel from, I think, Malaysia, South Korea and Singapore. So when all these other places ran out of oil to do their refining, Australia will lose its imports of petrol, diesel and aviation fuel, which means no planes, which means no fuel for tractors to grow food, which means no fuel to run mining trucks. It means no petrol for your SUVs. And Australia's only got about a month's reserve of this stuff. So if there really is a crunch coming in terms of a month or 2 month long closure.
Yeah. It's
crippling.
If the war is prolonged, the strait continues to be blocked, there's increased bombing attacks on where the oil and gas are produced, there will definitely be a lot of repercussions. But actually this dependence on fuel, on oil, bunker fuel and so on for other transportation means also really highlights the importance of electrification.
Yeah, but I wanted to finish with the Australian example because on the electricity side, it's different. Roughly 50% of electricity now comes from renewable sources, wind, solar, hydro, mainly some biomass, and that's grown quite quickly. Add to that a lot of battery storage for stability. Coal has been winding down. There is some gas plants. The lights won't go off in Australia, but you might not be able, and you could probably drive your EV to the shop. But if you want to get fuel at a petrol station or catch a plane, you might be in trouble. So the point is to get back to our theme of energy independence, or at least the benefit of renewable energy for electricity supply. That's a really good example. And that's exactly what should be repeated in ASEAN. Each country has its own renewable energy potential. Singapore has a bit of solar. Vietnam has a lot of wind and solar. Indonesia, huge amounts of solar, lots of geothermal. So my point is, if you can connect all these up, if they get their act together and connect themselves up, they can, at least for electricity, be much more resilient, I would say.
To the supply chain breakdowns, for sure. And I think one thing that has really come up that is super clear now is that the goal is the same. An interconnected grid for ASEAN, more renewables. The goal is the same. It's just that the reason or the push for it has now is leaning more heavily towards why this is critical for energy security. First, you are less exposed to supply chain breakdowns, as you just pointed out with the Australia example. And you prevent yourself from being held hostage by geopolitical events, because that is exactly what Iran is doing now, right? Holding the rest of the world hostage with the closure of the Strait, with its bombing activities, all these. You are preventing yourself from being held back by all these developments. And of course, the case for renewables, even things like nuclear, geothermal, is that they are all domestic resources. Even though nuclear, some countries may need to import like uranium and so on, because it is so energy dense, it is a very suitable. You don't need much of it in order to power your country for the long term. You can store it safely. And, that would actually also provide a stable base load, because the thing about renewables is intermittency, right? Sometimes at night your sun doesn't shine. Where are you going to get electricity from?
Well, batteries. And that's increasingly going to become the way. And in some cases, pumped hydro as well. That's the other thing that's being rolled out, which doesn't get a lot of attention.
So even for renewables, you need like a portfolio. And for nuclear, they also can provide a stable base load regardless of environmental conditions.
Yeah, and you can import. You don't just have to rely on one or two sources for uranium. Different sources. Yeah,
so I think this whole case also in the energy circles, people like to talk about the energy trilemma. Sustainability is one part of the triangle, and then you have energy security, and then you have energy affordability. In this case, in what the Middle Eastern war has shown us about the energy situation globally is how interconnected these three are. Now we are seeing energy prices spike because of the supply chain breakdowns. Energy security really depends on each country's exposure to how much Middle Eastern gas you import for your own energy needs, and also depends on your own energy mixes. So for Singapore, we rely 90% for natural gas, but our natural gas comes from various sources. You said Australia has 50% renewables. I think that definitely helps to cushion some of the impact of all these supply chain breakdowns. And then lastly, sustainability, right? I mean, now the case for renewables is no longer just about sustainability, but also in terms of energy security and energy affordability as well.
Yeah, and renewables, particularly wind and solar, but even with battery storage now, has proven to be quite cost effective. And that's the thing, right? If there's a war, the price of solar and wind isn't going to go up. It's not the wind is going to charge you more for blowing. And it's a large upfront investment, but then the ongoing costs of maintenance and so forth are much lower than constantly importing
high capital
gas.
costs, but low operating costs.
Yeah, so you don't have to worry about importing wind or solar, right? It's there. So that's the benefit. And same for, nuclear, obviously you would have to bring in nuclear uranium or other types of nuclear fuel. And for the reactors that you need to deal with the waste, then obviously. So, of course, nuclear is not perfect, but it has lots of other benefits.
Yeah. The point now, I think the biggest question now is, I think many countries recognize the importance of renewables. The question now is whether there's enough political will to continue the trajectory of building up these capabilities, even when there's so much other pressures.
Let me give you some hope, Audrey. I read something the other day which I thought was very interesting. Now, in the United States, despite the Trump administration's efforts to clamp down on renewable energy investment and wind and solar, guess how much solar the US added last year? Okay, it's not as much as China.
Tell me, David.
43 gigawatts. And this happened, I think, in the majority of the states that are actually Republican states. So it goes to show that politics is one thing, economics is another. And there is clearly big demand for power in the US, particularly for data centers. If they can do it in the States, they can do it in ASEAN.
That's true. I guess in ASEAN, also a tricky situation is you have so many different countries with so many different standards, so many trading frameworks. So you really need like someone pushing for it. continuing to push for it, you need, I guess, clarity of how the whole ASEAN grid will be realized. And especially at times like this where everyone's attention can be so diffused, you really need a very strong leader.
Yeah, so who's that going to be? ASEAN is not renowned for strong, united leaders or leadership, if I can put it that way. What I would like to see, that this war is a reminder, yet again, of ASEAN's quite delicate situation in terms of its energy security and dependence on imports. What I would like to see is the 11 leaders of ASEAN get together and have an emergency summit and say, what are we going to do about this? Do we need yet another reminder in 3 or 4 years or 5 years' time when there's another conflict?
Yeah. I mean, this year's ASEAN chair is the Philippines and next year is Singapore's turn. So
no, I think okay. Well, I mean, I'm sure Singapore would definitely want to talk about this, but I think we have to do it sooner.
Yeah. The Philippines is pretty exposed to to the situation now, right? Yeah.
They've started importing a lot of LNG from the Middle East, Vietnam as well. So they're quite exposed. Day by day. I mean, each day that goes past and the Strait of Hormuz is closed or shipping traffic is greatly reduced, the pressure on prices and governments increases, particularly in this part of the world.
So to answer the question asked in our headline, does renewable energy still matter given the war in the Middle East? I think for both of us, it's a resounding yes.
More than ever.
More than ever.
Definitely more than ever.
Renewable energy would be the answer to meeting our energy trilemma, right? Ensuring energy remains affordable. As David said, your sun or your wind's not going to charge you more money during a war to generate electricity. It's climate friendly, and at the same time, it's considered a domestic resource, so you don't really face the threat of supply chain breakdowns or being held hostage by bad actors.
Yeah, but like we said in the last podcast, renewable energy is a key part of the energy violin. We need lots of strands going forward: battery storage, wind, solar, geothermal, nuclear, possibly fusion, nuclear energy, and whatever else comes up that science invents later on. The more diversity we have, the less exposed we are to just disruptions to just certain types of fuels.
Well, that wraps it up for this episode of Green Pulse. Once again, I'm Audrey Tan.
And I'm David Fogarty. You can email us your thoughts on this episode. Links to our articles and how to connect with us on social media are in our show notes. This episode was edited by Hadju Rahim.
And if you would like to keep up to date with other environmental news happening in Singapore, don't miss following our Green Pulse newsletter on LinkedIn. Thanks for listening.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening.